Hi everyone, welcome back from lunch. We'll be starting in a minute. If I could request everyone to settle down, please. Our next panel is Can the Global South Come Together to Accelerate MDB Reforms? Our speakers are Mr. Balazs Sarvari, Senior Lecturer, Converse University of Budapest, Mr. M. Sait Akman, Director of G20 Studies Center Economic Policy Research Foundation of Turkey, Elizabeth Sidropoulos, Chief Executive of South African Institute of International Affairs, Bambang Broadjaneiro, Professor, Institute for Economics and Social Research, University of Indonesia, moderated by Tanu Goyal, Senior Fellow, ICRIER from India. Could I request our speakers and moderator to join us on stage, please? Thank you. Over to you.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to this post-lunch session on Can the Global South Come Together to Accelerate Multilateral Development Bank Reforms? And let me just leave you with two verbs that are used in this title, which is come together and accelerate. My name is Tanu Goyal. I'm a senior fellow at ICRIER, and my organization was involved in the MDB reform agenda set out by the Indian G20 presidency. Pulkit has already mentioned the affiliations of the panelists. We are joined by esteemed panelists, which they are from diverse backgrounds and geographies. So instead of going over again about their affiliation, I'd like to mention that Balazs there is from Hungary, Saeed is from Turkey, Elizabeth is from South Africa, and Professor Bambang is from Indonesia, and today I got to know that Professor Bambang has actually been to all the G20 presidencies that have happened so far. So I think he is the G20 veteran amongst us here. So before we dive into the conversation and come back to the two questions, the two words that I left you with, let me just set a bit of a brief context on some of the recent work that has been done on the MDB reform agenda. Now, while this has been a recurring theme for several G20 presidencies, under the Indian G20 presidency, which marked the first emerging markets troika, a comprehensive plan was laid out for recommending an updated MDB ecosystem to address the challenges of 21st century. And here we must imagine that challenges of 21st century are actually different from different geographies. An independent expert group was established, and it suggested that MDBs should become better, bigger, and more effective. The recommendation touched upon various aspects, from broadening the vision to streamlining operational approaches and even expanding the financing capacity. At the start of the session, the two verbs I left you with, come together and accelerate. Now, what has happened is that in the last 1 year, while there has been it's been more than 1 year since the reform recommendations were made, the progress on these reforms have actually been slow and uneven. In some cases, in fact, there has not been any progress at all. And I think some of the stock-taking exercises, including one done by ICRIER, shows that there is a lot of divergence, there's lack of uniformity in the way the reform process has happened. This is where the Global South, I believe, needs to come together. And in this panel, we intend to cover 3 points. One is, what are the expectations and perspectives from the Global South on the MDB reform agenda? What are some of the challenges and methods of navigating through these challenges, ideas that can come from Global South? And third, how forums such as this can actually contribute to accelerating the MDB reform process. So let me start with a very fundamental point. In the last 1 year or so, there's been a push to expand the vision and mission and incorporate global public goods and transboundary challenges into the whole MDB ecosystem. My first question is to you, Balazs, which is more on the need or on the vision and mission that is laid out for MDBs today. Do you think the MDBs are fit for their purpose from the perspective of Global South?
Thank you, Tanu. Actually, I feel that this panel doesn't happen the first time. I think just a quick note to the audience that we spoke and prepared that much for this panel that I think it was 3 or 5 times more we spoke about the topic than what we have here on stage. So now you will just get the quintessence of our previous talks. And those talks were full of hope to reach big targets. And there was some criticism also, as it's also feelable from your question. But before saying anything concrete, I would like to add one more note that I come from a country where I can use unlimited drinkable water for washing my car. I think this is a very big bias, and I always feel myself even guilty and responsible, and sometimes, ready to be misled when we speak about Global South and sustainability, how to help, how to contribute. These are the limitations also, what I say. I wanted to clarify it at the beginning. So criticism. From this background, I feel development, the term development in multilateral development banks is not valid. It's a bias, it's a misleading term. I believe that 3 very different scenarios are mixed under the term development. The 3 scenarios, 3 protocols, I think we have to distinguish. 1, to give, provide, ensure for all human beings on earth the basic standards. If it's done, though how far we are from it, if it's done, then we arrived to the origo, to the 0 point. It's not called development in my eyes to reach to the 0 point. It's also here, I think, a good example can be shared that, many projects focusing on Global South, let's say, fighting against poverty, setting the standards of $1 expenses a day to report good numbers at the end. These projects are focusing on those who are already having 99 cents. It's easy to give, to show up big numbers, to jump above $1 per day. But what about the others? What about the poorest of the poors? Nobody can be left behind. And when we speak about development, I feel many times this aspect is hidden. Another element from the 3, so this was the first. The second one, it can be called development, improvement, catch-up process. Though there are questions, catch-up for the average, catch-up for all. These are professional parts, but now to continue the third element, I think development also gives a bias on not speaking about the leapfrog moments. I think in the Global South, there is knowledge, there is capacity, and the infrastructure, the technology is provided to not target only catch-up targets, but to go beyond, to show the next era of development. Many times, I think in history, what we witness is that the periphery or the half periphery shows the next step for humanity. If all these are united and there is more voice given to the Global South, I would just like to, very shortly, not taking the time from you colleagues, say 7 targets that I believe are fundamentally important to reach. One is fair voting system in the MDBs in a structure that fits to the current world economic structure. Clarify the mandates. I think there is time to renew the mandates of the MDBs, including not only opening toward climate terms, but to sustainability in the meaning of SDGs. I think sustainability mandate should be applied. Also, I think there is a lot and urgent to do at the metrics to have comprehensive feedbacks on the impact, reached or not reached. Then the standards of the MDBs should be unified. The administration should be eased a lot from ESG to procurement and many others to catalyze the MDB cooperation between the MDBs, to avoid the one-size-fits-all approach, because there are very important regional differences. And if these are not applied, then even with a loud global south, we cannot reach, MDBs cannot reach the goals. If there will be more time, I'm happy to speak more about the leapfrog chances, but now I just give the word back to you. Thank you, Tanu.
Thank you, Balaj. I think you've sort of summarized the IG report in a very good way. And you also let out the secret that we've actually had 5 rounds of chit-chat among ourselves on this panel. So, picking from the point that you stressed on, which is the reinforcing the importance of sustainable development goals, let me turn to you now, Professor Bambang, that do you believe that MDBs today are too occupied with one set of goals, largely environmental related, while the developmental priorities and sustainability is taken in some way a backseat?
Yeah, I like to continue what Balas just mentioned, especially when he emphasized on no one left behind. I think everybody in this room remembers this no one left behind coming from actually our ultimate global goal, which is Sustainable Development Goals. And if you remember the 17 goals in the SDG, 15 of them covering the economic sustainability, social sustainability, and environmental sustainability. Goal number 16, as you know, is about justice, about peace, and goal number 17 about partnership. But then, when SDG ratified by the UN in 2015, I believe there is lack of kind of global coordination between the UN itself and the MDBs. As a result, I haven't heard, the management of any MDBs saying that they like to turn their bank from development bank into sustainability bank. Instead, now, if you meet some of the management from MDBs, they will tell you, we would like to transform our institution from a regular development bank into climate bank, which is good. We know that climate change is, very urgent, but don't forget, the spirit of having the MDBs coming after Bretton Woods meeting, in which they got the mandate to trying to reduce poverty as much as possible on the face of earth. And I think if we look around and we review what they have done so far, they have been successful. I think, for example, if we look at the last 4 G20 hosts, starting from Indonesia, India, Brazil, and next year, South Africa, we can be part of G20 partly because the support from any development bank that we have been dealing with. So it means that they have done successfully to help our countries at least to elevate from low-income country into middle-income country. And that makes our economy bigger, and now we are part of the G20. But of course, there has to be new paradigm. And this new paradigm should be recorded through the SDG. Don't forget, even though those 4 countries already categorized as middle-income country, and 4 of us already have relatively high GDP in total, but there are still pockets in each of these countries that still needs support in terms of development issue. They still have high poverty. Some of them, they still have maybe problem with the hunger. Some of them, for example, in Indonesia, have problem with stunting. So there are still a lot of development issues that needs to be supported by the MDBs. And don't forget, other than the member of G20, there are still a lot of low-income countries today existing in Global South. It means development issue is still very much relevant, and I think the banks or MDBs should try to balance more, between the idea of supporting the climate financing or climate change, which is very important, but they have to balance it with the needs of more economic and social sustainability that might have higher priority in those low-income countries. So by doing that, then the bank is, in my opinion, it's better if the bank telling everybody, we would like to be the sustainability bank. By saying sustainability, it doesn't mean only environmental sustainability, but also economic and social sustainability, more relevant for the low-income countries. Last but not least, I like to pose a rhetoric question. Do MDBs need emerging market and developing economy more than emerging market and developing economy need MDB? If it was after Bretton Woods, of course, the later one is correct, because at that time, many countries need development banks. But after, as I mentioned, development banks successfully increase the income per capita, the total GDP of this low-income country becoming middle-income country, then I believe it should be the other way around. It is MDBs needs more emerging market and developing economy, because some of the countries already have the capacity at least to top up the capital, to increase the financing ability of the MDB itself. And of course, with the ability to be involved more in the capitalization of the MDBs, then of course there should be more voice and more power for Global South in any of the MDBs. Of course, we might not be the biggest, but at least if we compare, for example, US and India, of course, US has the biggest GDP, their income per capita is very high, but India is getting there. Someday the GDP of India will be very close to US. It means India should have more say, China should have more say, Indonesia should have more say, Brazil, South Africa, and others. So by doing that, then the governance in MDB will be more balanced, and MDB will reflect better the needs of developing economy.
Thank you, Professor Bang Bang. I can't agree more with you on two things. One, very soon, hopefully, India's GDP will be close to the US's GDP, and also on the importance that you've sort of reiterated, the importance of sustainable development goals in this entire conversation. So I think it's a good segue to turn to Turkey, the Turkish presidency, and Said sitting here, because it was the Turkish presidency actually which was at the cusp of the Millennium Development Goals and the Sustainable Development Goals, and some of the pioneering work under the Turkish presidency actually got SGDs into the MDB reform agenda. So Said, if I may ask you, in your opinion, how has this MDB reform agenda evolved in the more recent years? And what do you think have been some of the remarkable contributions of the Global South in the entire conversation that has happened so far?
Thank you. It's my pleasure to be here. Tanu, thank you for the question. Yes, it started more than a decade ago when I remember when Turkey was presiding, we were talking about the multilateral development banks, sustainability issues. And of course, when you just bring these two issues, how to finance them and how to put them into a streamline. And there have been a lot of ideas since then. And also mainly from the developing countries. Now we call them as Global South or developing economies. I remember after the Indonesian period, these ideas actually intensified, and in the last 4 years, and I believe during the South African term, they will add something more. But the reform process for the multilateral development banks is still going on. So what happened? I remember, and many of you will remember that, many developing countries were asking for money. And money for achieving their development goals. But which goals we are talking about? They should be more in line with the sustainable development goals, of course. I remember the very naive and good initiative by Mia Motley of Barbados Initiative, where they asked for $650 billion of SDR issuance to the developing countries to combat with climate change and to recover from the COVID. It was the years of COVID, of course. Then these ideas, which started for asking money and some more financing, have been taken up by other countries also in the global north. In the Summit for a New Global Financing Pact, for example, they were talking about reforming the World Bank, the IBRD and IDA mainly. That was important. Then we had some other initiatives, not necessarily linked to MDBs only, but also reforming the international financial mechanisms from the vulnerable countries. Mainly, it was initiated by Ghana and other African countries. That was an important thing that we always forget in our minds, but Accra Marrakesh agenda was also important. That was an initiative from Africa. And then we had the India's initiative. That was for triple agenda, triple mandate, triple financing, and triple funding mechanisms. So it's evolving, but what do they bring? Last year in Indian declaration and this year in Brazilian declaration in Rio, we saw that the countries endorsed the G20 roadmap. For what? For achieving better, bigger, and more effective MDBs. Well, what do we mean by this? Maybe they evolve in their visions, incentive structures, financing mechanisms, operational mechanisms, and financial capacities to make it better, especially the capacities of multilateral development banks with respect to risk-based operations, and project preparation support for the countries, and private capital mobilization, and hedging solutions, especially encouraging the use of local currencies. That's to make them better. And of course, by bigger, we mean we need to increase our financing capacities of the multilateral development banks, and more effective in terms of their maximizing their developmental impact in financing projects. So these were some things, and we had the G20 roadmap finally. Of course, we will see, and we will, and all the developing countries, maybe it's time for South Africa to have a review of what will be done through these reform processes. We are now entering into a new stage, not only reforming or putting the ideas, because there are a lot of commitments going on in terms of increasing the financing capacity, in terms of increasing the technical capacity of multilateral development banks. But I see that we also need to focus on some missing points and flows. For example, the capital increase by IBRD. They didn't translate into more lending to African countries, for example. The IBRD lending to Africa, in terms of its all financing in the world, was less than 1% only. That's not less. I think that's very much close to your idea that we should not leave anyone behind. And I think in that case, Africa should be better prioritized. And IBRD transfers to IDA also decreased in time, because IDA is much more available for the least developed countries. So capital increases through the IBRD should be tied to some proportional increase also to countries like African countries, the least developed countries. And G20 countries should also, if they give so many promises, they should also double their contributions to IDA and allow the lower and middle income countries for more concessional lending opportunities. If we talk about the financial system reform, we also, in G20, Professor Bambang is a veteran of this, and he knows very well that we also talk about the IMF. But IMF is more on conditionalities. What we are talking here is more about developmental projects. And I think we still need to go too far, a long way in terms of not only giving commitments. It is becoming more streamlined towards, for example, rather than asking only for money. So what multilateral development banks could do to increase their capacities, to learn more from their experience, and how to get better collaboration with the countries. That was, I think, a viewpoint note that after Indians' idea of this independent group of experts, they provided some recommendations that we can talk about.
Yeah. So thank you. I think you've sort of, again, very well put out what were some of the recommendations that were made by the Indian presidency, and now, Elizabeth, all eyes are on South Africa. So if I may ask you, what is your plan on the MDB reform process? How do you plan to take forward the roadmap that the Brazilians have put out? And how do you think you'll engage further in this discussion?
Great, thanks, Tan. I think maybe a couple of points by way of introduction. I think the first point is that ever since 1994, when South Africa returned to the international fold, I think we have we've been one of the strong proponents of multilateral, more broadly multilateral reform, but specifically when it comes to the World Bank and the IMF. And so this is something that is very much, I think, in South Africa's DNA. And I think we've had a number of notable officials, senior cabinet ministers who have really driven it over many years, and it included getting an extra seat on the World Bank, and this year, of course, the IMF, which was also a long fight. So that, just by way of introduction, that this is really something that South Africa has focused on for a long time. The second point, of course, is that South Africa has made it quite clear that our plan is really to build on what has gone before us, in the case of Brazil, what has gone before us in the case of India and Indonesia, to consolidate and to continue the agenda. And there, I think, I'm going to make some points specifically about what we want to do with, or what government wants to plan, the official track plans to do with MDBs. But I think it might also be useful, because you alluded to it right at the beginning, Tanu, is to say that one of the issues that the development working group during the South African presidency is taking very seriously is the concept of global public goods. And it's a contested term. Certainly for some very good reasons, but I think putting it on the agenda and actually beginning a dialogue about how we deal with global public goods and how we finance global public goods, I think is very important, because what we don't want to do, and what we don't want to have, is a situation where the broader transboundary challenges that you spoke about completely overwhelm what the original development mandates of these multilateral development banks. For example, we already see with the African Development Bank, 40% has been sort of allocated to climate. That in itself is not necessarily undevelopmental or anti-developmental, but there are also obviously many other areas that need focus. So I think that's important in terms of the Sherpa track, the development working group. In the finance track, in terms of what has come already out of Brazil, and I think Brazil made really significant progress on laying the roadmap, and the South Africans have emphasized, Treasury has emphasized the importance of reviewing the consistency of standards and requirements across NDBs, across national development banks as well. That's important. We mustn't forget about national development banks when we're trying to find as much capital as we possibly can. And of course the vertical climate and environmental funds, where Brazil also produced, I think, some really excellent, an excellent set of recommendations. And then how does that contribute to the broader efficiency also of the global climate finance system? And there, the issue of adaptation is also very important for South Africa. We have for too long focused on mitigation, and while South Africa may have its own mitigation challenges as a major current emitter, when we talk about the African continent, adaptation is very important, and there we know that the contribution has been very small. Just a point about NDBs, because we focus a lot on the MDBs, and yet there is capacity also to work much more closely with national development banks and to build up those capacities. I mean, I think what's really useful is the Financing Common Summit meeting that will be held in February here in Cape Town, which is about sort of bringing some of those issues to the table. I think NDBs, particularly when you're talking about SDG localization, the NDBs are uniquely positioned to be able to do that because they have so much local knowledge. And so so the interface between MDBs and NDBs is, I think, something that is going to be important. The other one, which is related, and again, it's very much in the climate space, but it speaks to the way in which the debates play out, is what is the financing potential of carbon markets, again, as part of the broader sustainability agenda. The one last point that I want to make there is the issue of the discussions happening in the G20 in a couple of forums, and I think the necessity of making sure that we are integrating and there is coherence here. So there's the conversations happening in the IFA working group, in the International Financial Architecture working group, and in the Sustainable Finance working group. And I think it's important to look at how those correlate. Let me leave it there, and we'll come back.
Sure. I'm also mindful of the time, and we have to keep 15 minutes for Q&A, but we already have sort of breached that time. Janvi, if I'm allowed to just take 2 or 3 more minutes with the panelists, just one more question. So I think what I get from you, Elizabeth, is more about striking that balance. And even when you talk about these two things, as you pointed out, these are not mutually exclusive. There are high degree of complementarities when you look at sustainable development goals and global public goods or transboundary challenges. And somewhere it's about finding the balance and having the funding financing the right goals for different geographies. I know that your institute will also be the T20, will be spearheading the T20 process, and this brings us to the importance of the civil society in such forums, the important role that they play in getting ideas together and bringing out certain solutions for addressing some of the problems. So it's just an open question to the panel, whoever wants to take it. What do you think is the role, how do you think the civil society and think tanks can move together in finding some of the, some solutions to the issues that the Global South is facing today, more through the MDB reform process?
Well, I would add 2 points shortly to this. One is innovation. Innovation, when I mentioned before the leapfrog moments, I would give an insight to a very concrete financial instrument. I think it can improve a lot MDB's efficiency. It's called Green Preferential Capital Requirement Program. It started from academic research just a few years ago. Actually, in Italian, Dutch, UK, and Hungarian samples are proved the green hypothesis, which says if a mortgage is financing an energy efficient buildings, restoration, building, construction, then it has a lower probability of default. If this is existing, if this is true, and it's actually proven by all 4 samples, then a lower interest rate may be applied for such loans, such credits to finance energy efficient improvements of houses or households. If this exists, then I think it can contribute a lot to the sustainability mandate or profile of MDBs. We can go deep to that if somebody is interested. I'm happy to share more. I think this is a very, very good innovation and offering leapfrog for even for the Global South already. The other very important thing is capacity building. It was touched in the morning, this topic, but I would like to highlight that if the people with university degree know about sustainable finance, I believe it's not enough. The households, the people, the companies, everywhere has to be open for that. And it means that it's not an isolated course, sustainable finance, for those who are studying finance. It must be embedded as a cross-curricular element of education. For legal studies, engineering studies, and so on. I really believe that this is the future, and for that we need people who are ready to apply for that, not only professionals at banks, even MDBs.
You would not...
Yeah. I think we have to admit now the climate financing for both mitigation as well as adaptation has been the mainstream of a majority of MDB operation. Then the role of civil society and think tank is how they can fill the gap between, for example, the ideal goal in mitigation through energy transition with the needs of majority low-income country. So, for example, in the energy transition, people start thinking about early retirement of coal-fired power plant. But then in many low-income countries, they're still struggling with rural electrification because their electrification rate is still very low. So I think the civil society and think tank needs to remind the MDBs, yes, energy transition is important, but this energy transition has to be in context with the needs of the low-income country in which they still need electrification to rural area. So this kind of thing, I think, will be very crucial for civil society and think tank to keep reminding MDBs. And don't forget, we trying also to support the blended financing for SDGs, including for the climate financing. And then the role of civil society and think tank is to help the MDBs trying to be part of the catalytic financing in order to mobilize more the financing from private and commercial financing. Thank you.
Okay, so let me use a bit of my veto power as the chair, and let me just move to the audience before coming back to the rest of the panelists. So if there are any questions, please feel free to ask. Keep your questions pointed. Refrain from making comments. I'm not saying this myself. There was a guideline that was given to me which said that I must say this. Please don't make comments. Just put your questions. Keep them short and pointed. So anybody has any questions for the panel? Yeah.
Yeah, thank you so much. My name is Sibo Aigbe Oakina. I'm a legal officer with the Central Bank of Nigeria. So my question relates to multilateral development banks. I know there's a requirement, there's a checklist whereby you can assess, for you to be able to assess the funds, right, in terms of adhering to compliance. My question is outside compliance, maybe the funds have been disbursed. Are there any robust mechanism to evaluate and monitor these funds that have been disbursed? Because sometimes we hear that these funds, when they disburse these funds, is being used to pay salaries or used to do any other thing. They are just interested in paying back, but I just want to know whether the funds that have been disbursed out is being used for the actual project or just for any other cost rather than that.
Fair. We can collect one or two more questions, yeah.
Hi, Anit Mukherjee from ORF America. My question to Elizabeth, I'm glad that you raised the question of global public goods. Do you think that the multilateral development banks only consider now climate as the global public good, or they should be also considering other stuff like food security and health and education? Thank you.
Okay. Are there any more questions? I have one that I'm tempted to ask. Yeah.
Deepak Mishra, Career India. I used to work for MDB for 20 years, so I've seen the things from inside. The question I have is, MDBs to some extent are monopoly lenders in their own place. So there are regional development banks who are, regional monopolies, and then you have World Bank, which is like a global monopoly. So until you create real competition for this, MDBs through national development banks and having to compete among each other, there will never be a serious threat to their existence. And so, Professor Bang Bang, some of you have been very closely involved. I have been personally involved in some of the reform work, but you don't see the urgency. So is there a way to create more competition for MDBs so that they start to feel the fire under the chair, so that they start to, because a lot of that we are preaching, talking, doing it, and you see it's not really falling into the deaf ear. So any suggestions, ideas for that? Thank you.
Sure. Any more questions?
Good afternoon. My name is Vanshika, and I'm with the Asian Development Bank. So my question is, how do you envision the role of the newer non-legacy MDBs, including AIIB and the NDB, and what can you throw light on ways in which they can structure themselves more differently and cater to the developing member countries more efficiently and effectively?
All right. So we have 4 questions. One on the use of funds, whether the funds are being used for their purpose. Second is on global public goods. Third, on competition. And I think Vanshika's question was quite close in terms of what is going to be the trajectory for the regional development banks. And my question is just, with South African taking the presidency, the emerging market troika ends as US joins the troika now. There are lots of speculations. What do we expect? So I keep these questions open for the panelists to take one by one. And Said, why don't you go first?
Thank you. I can reply the first question about the projects. I think this is an issue that we should give more attention, because it's not only we get the money, but how do we file the projects and how do we deal with the projects. That requires a big capacity. And in that sense, I see there are national authorities in many countries that help the projects. But of course, there is no unified way of doing this. So we learn from each other's maybe experiences as well. But one thing maybe related to your previous question about think tanks and universities, I think they should be able to provide more consultancy and technical advice for the projects. That could be another potential contribution from the research side, from the universities, if the projects really fits to the ideas and can be financed or should be financed, and also it could be useful for those who file the projects that they can fully utilize in line with the objectives. Because although we have ample amount of money, still we need to use it efficiently, because when we talk about calls for more money, it's very difficult to, it's very easy to have commitments, but very difficult to deliver them. So I think in that sense, we have to make them more efficient. And I think universities are not only public institutions, but universities are important in this sense.
Yeah. So now we have 1 minute each for Elizabeth, Professor Bambang, and Balazs, you to respond. One each.
So must I?
So there were 2 questions that were addressed.
Yes, you addressed one and Anit. Right, do you want me to respond?
Yeah.
So on to Anit's question on GPGs, no, I mean, GPGs are not just climate. It can be about pandemics and health and absolutely and food security. The issue here is that you don't want that to erode, or food systems, you don't want that to erode other developmental priorities. So it is about looking at additional financing mechanisms and instruments, and there are some ideas on the table through civil society. And I segue into civil society here and say that it's not just think tanks and universities that can play a role in pushing this, but it's also the more activist part of civil society. A lot of the conversations, a lot of the reforms on the agenda that are moving forward today have been also pushed by by civil society activists. And I think that's an important dimension. And I think the linkages between the Think 20 and the C20 can also be very important in that regard. To your question about what we do with the new troika, that is no longer a developing country troika, I think, it is what it is. We have to work together. I think we have to be pragmatic about what can work and about also how we shape the way in which we want to drive certain things. Clearly, it's going to be a little bit more difficult to push some things and maybe a little easier to push others. But I think we have to be pragmatic and we have to keep the train moving. As long as we keep the train moving, we can also pick up things and pick up momentum in subsequent years. And I think that's the history of the MDB reform over the last several years, has been exactly that.
Professor Bambang.
Yeah. There are two types of competitor for MDBs. The first one, I think the emergence of new multilateral development bank like AIB and New Development Bank, plus all the National Development Bank or National Development Financing Institution. But then, the second one, I think the most, threatening competitor actually is the government itself. I mean, the government that used to be the recipient of the loan from the MDBs, now they are able to raise their own money. For example, in Indonesia, in the past, it was dominated by the loan from the World Bank, from bilateral, but then now, majority of our budget dominated by government bonds. And we have been able to raise the bonds in US dollar, in euro, in yen, also in, of course, in our local currency. It means that the relevance of MDBs should focus on the program. Because if you just trying to offer the financing, then the host country will say, no, thank you. We can get our own money. So why don't you go with your own ideas? But if you come with the good programs that really answer the basic needs of the host country or recipient country, then they will welcome it because that's part of the transformation of their economy.
You want to say? Okay, so the screen in front of me, you guys can't see it. I see there's a red screen that says time's up. But I'm going to take, if you don't mind, no? Not even 30 seconds? Okay, we have to wrap up. Sorry. So the panelists will be available after the session outside. Maybe you can catch a cup of tea with them and have conversations on the other points that they want to make. Thank you so much for being a brilliant audience. I'm just overwhelmed to see so many people join after lunch. Doesn't look like a post-lunch session to me. Thank you so much. Thank you.
My sincere apologies to the panel. We do have to keep the train running on time, but thank you so much for an excellent session. If I could invite you to the top of the stage for a quick photograph, please. The next session would be diminishing distances. We will from the Cape of Sao Roque to the Cape of Good Hope. We will be discussing a theme that's been running throughout on South-South cooperation. We've discussed how the Global South's emergence now means that they need to be the incumbents and they need to take ownership of multilateral processes. And how do we do that will be the topic of the next conversation. On the panel would be Luciana Muniz, Project Director at the Brazilian Center for International Relations, my colleague from ORF, Malancha Chakravarti, Senior Fellow and Deputy Director for Research, Jose Alvarez, the Coordinator for International Organizations and G20 Committee at the Argentine Council of International Relations, and of course our co-host, Max Bokwana, from the Chief Executive Officer at the Thabo Mbeki Foundation, moderated by Bonolo Magele, Program Manager, Center for Human Rights at the University of Pretoria. If I could request the panelists and the moderator to join us on stage. Bonolo, if I can hand it to you.
Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to our panelists. As the moderator has said, in this conversation, we are going to look at diminishing the distance within the Global South. And we'll also reflect on the fact that the Global South as a geopolitical and geoeconomic player has been underpinned by successive G20 presidencies from Indonesia, India, Brazil, and South Africa having to take over. So in this conversation, and maybe just to help us as an appetizer, I was going to give you 1 minute. So maybe I'll give Luciana, Mulunchi, and Jose 1 minute and Max 4 minutes that he requested to reflect on this idea that why is it important, both symbolically and practically, to reflect on this idea of diminishing geographical distances or diminishing distances within the Global South? Just a minute.
Hello. Hi. Well, good afternoon, everyone. First of all, I would like to start with a big thanks to the organizers for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be here today representing the Brazilian Center for International Relations, SEBRI, and it's a pleasure to be sharing the panel with my colleagues. I think we need to face that geography matters. But more than that, we need to work on cooperation level. We need to join efforts to make our Global South priorities and agendas to move on the next G20 priorities. So if, in a way, geography matters, we also need to put some of our differences aside and try to move together in a coordination and a cooperation way.
Hello. It's a pleasure to be here in Cape Town, and thank you so much. I think geography matters, maybe, but our struggles matter more. And there may be differences, but I think there are more similarities. And it is these similar struggles which make it imperative for us to work together. It is 2024, so many years after the whole world committed to making this world a better place. First time we had universal goals for the whole world. The North and the South both agreed that we need one set of goals for everyone. It's time that we remind ourselves and we don't forget the historic, the landmark achievement that it was. And we are today in not very happy times. About 868 million people in Africa are currently suffering from food insecurity. We, of course, have millions of people who are also ravaged by war globally. We have a situation where poverty has increased for millions of households. And many of the progress, the development outcomes that we achieved in early 2000s, from 2000 to 2010, have regressed. I think that provides the greatest reason for us to work together and not let anything matter more than these common struggles that the Global South faces.
Thank you.
Hello? Yes. Well, first off, thank you to ORF and to the Thabo Mbeki Foundation for hosting us, and also to Kari, whom I'm representing at this point. I would like to agree with what Malancha and Luciana were saying. Geography matters, but what's more important is to put our differences aside and to work together for common struggles. In that sense, one of the main achievements of the Brazilian G20 presidency, which was the Global Alliance Against Hunger and Poverty, is definitely a milestone. What we can differ about is which are the best policies. That is why the Global Alliance has a policy basket. Some may be more effective, such as market-driven or market-facing approaches, but definitively all of the policies matter. And to look forward to these common struggles, we have to go towards consensus, and that is definitely the basis of the G20. We have to make sure that the diminishing distances are reflected in diminishing conflicts between ourselves, and that consensus remains the core value of the G20 as it has from its beginning. Thank you.
Bonola, thank you very much. I suspect that what we require from these various panels as we talk about what will be South Africa doing, what will G20 doing, I think my warning is that the key thing, we must manage our expectations. I think our expectations are a bit exaggerated. I am a bit cynical, and I think there are reasons to be cynical. In June 2002, this discussion that is taking place here was taking place in Canada. And everything else that the minister and the presidency was raising was something that was discussed in Canada. The issue of partnerships, the issue of repatriation of stolen money from Africa in particular, the issue of capital flights, so the issue of poverty, and a number of these matters, and including the issue of accountability and good governance in our continent. It's many years later, we're still struggling with those issues. These issues were repeated in the various Doha development rounds, exactly the same way in ensuring that the countries of the South, the developing countries and the least developed countries are actually put in a better pedestal as far as the world trade is concerned and financing is concerned. That project was abandoned. Recently, we have the SDGs. If you just take one, the issue of poverty. By 2015, we were talking about 700 million people that are hungry. Today, we're talking about 723 million people that are hungry. We've just got 5 years or so to reach 2030. We have had COP26 and COP29. Exactly the same issues of just transition and issues of funding have been raised in Paris. They were raised in Baku last week. We still have not resolved those issues. We are sitting here again, repeating exactly the same agenda. I suspect the question that must be answered in the room here, what happens, what made all of these undertakings and commitments to fail? And I think that's the most important question that we must answer. And what do we do going forward to make sure that we do not fail? And what are the accountability methods that we put in place so that those that have made commitments meet with those commitments? So that's really where my cynicism starts, but at the same time where I'm saying the biggest challenge for us is to be able to respond to those issues. The net result is that there are two fundamental issues that are glaring in the developing countries or underdeveloped countries, in particular Africa, is the issue of poverty. If there's any one thing that we should be dealing with on the agenda is how do we eradicate poverty. But because of this distance that is big, the issue of poverty is exacerbated by the issue of debt burden.
Pramex, maybe as a follow-up question then, rightfully so that we have been having these conversations, right? And so how do we, in the most practical way, how do we ensure that we move from a place where we don't just have pretty policies, but there seems to be a problem somewhere. There seems to be, you know, an implementation gap of some sort. So as we reimagine the future, what is it actually that we then need to do to ensure that we don't have this conversation again in the next couple of years, and we don't have these pretty policies that are really not, you know, resulting into anything sustainable? And if you can help us reflect on the seeming implementation gap that is there.
Well, no, I'm thinking, as far as our continent is concerned, there's a section in the Agenda 2063 that deals with the flagship projects. If we can just do one thing in the Sub-Sahara and say, can we have a conversation about the building of the Great Inga hydroelectric scheme? And that's it. And focus everything on that, because that's what is going to fuel development. That's what's going to make sure that there's proper energy in the region. That's what's going to help us to industrialize and manufacture. If you go to Mauritania and Senegal, there's an outstanding development of the GTA deep port to be able to facilitate trade in that region. If we can say then on the Sahel region, let's focus on that GTA. If you look at the Maghreb, there's an outstanding Maghreb transnational transport project. If we're able to undertake that, where you will be able to link Tunisia, link Egypt, link Morocco, and all of the countries in the Maghreb region, that will facilitate infrastructure development in the area. There's an East Africa railway corridor. So I'm saying if you take just these 4 practical projects of infrastructure and say we'll do nothing else in the next 10 years, but we focus simple on these projects, you will see what they do with the development and what they do with employment and dealing with poverty.
Thank you. And maybe let me bring Jose here then. Given that South Africa is taking over the G20 presidencies, right? So what are some of the key areas you would want to see South Africa focus on? But also this idea that how can South Africa take from what has been done by Indonesia, India, and Brazil and almost institutionalize it? You know, so that's the starting point, reflecting on what has been done by Indonesia, India, and Brazil, and codify some of the gains that are there and institutionalize them. But moving forward, what are some of the G20 methods and really important specific key areas that you would want South Africa to focus on?
Thank you for that question, Bonolo. Going back to what I was saying earlier, I think the main learning that we have from the past 3 presidencies is the importance of consensus. Indonesia could have easily gone a different route, but they didn't. I was a bit concerned yesterday when I heard a suggestion in the ministerial address of modifying the consensus for a sufficient consensus. And we all know that that would have led to the dismemberment of the G20 in several occasions in its history if it had been followed. During the first Trump presidency, we had to, during the German, Argentine, and Japanese presidencies, we had to accommodate the positions of one country regarding the Paris Agreement situation, and we had to put specific paragraphs within the leaders' declaration to be able to reach that consensus. That was a hard negotiation, but it was well done, well managed in several presidencies. And Indonesia did the same during the 2022 presidency. After the Russian invasion of Ukraine, it would have been easy to take a majority standpoint versus the point of some other members in the G20, but the navigation and the negotiations were able to arrive at a language that was consensus-based. So I think going forward for South Africa it would be very important to maintain that principal core value of the G20 as it has always been, and because it also guarantees one of the other core pillars of the G20, which is the equal footing of all of its members, especially when we're talking of a forum where obviously Europe is overrepresented and some of the global south areas are underrepresented. Fortunately now we have the African Union as well, and we welcome them there. One of the things that, going in line with what Max was saying, that could bring the African Union to have more engagement, in my view, would be if South Africa posts the possibility for them to co-chair some of the task forces that they've been thinking of setting up. I believe that the task forces on economic growth and artificial intelligence, as well as food security, are going to be crucial. I believe, in line with Agenda 2063, as Max was saying, probably the first two would be interesting for the African Union to co-chair. And regarding artificial intelligence, I think it would be important to not go with a regulation-first approach, but rather to go with a more evidence-based approach. In what sense? Regardless of the discussion on big tech, which we've already heard of today in the DPI panel, we have to watch what the situation is in the countries and blocks that have tried to regulate before artificial intelligence actually deployed itself in a full fashion. We have the EU that's trying to see how they can redraft or reverse what they've done. In the case of the US, we can see what already happened in the space of blockchain technology and crypto economy. What generally happens with all disruptive technologies, right? Back in 2012, New York was a hotbed of blockchain activity, but then the regulators decided to go with the BitLicense project, and suddenly New York was devoid of any blockchain capacity. Everyone moved out, either to countries of the global south that were more welcoming and more embracing of these technologies and that actually solved the day-to-day problems of users in the global south, or they moved to different jurisdictions even within the US. The counterpoint is Wyoming, which, being the least populous US state, suddenly has over 3,000 companies because they were crypto-friendly in their legislation. They went for an evidence-based approach, and as the technology was developing, the legislation started coming out to accompany that evolution. So in that sense, another thing that was done in Indonesia is the establishment of the Digital Economy Working Group. And the task force that's going to be, that was already announced by South Africa and included in the Rio Declaration, is going to report to that working group. So I think that maintaining the focus on digital economy and artificial intelligence, but again, not in a regulation-first approach, but rather an evidence-based approach after the fact and accompanying the evolution of these new disruptive technologies is what South Africa could do best. Thank you.
Thank you. So, Luciana, building on what Jose just said, perhaps help us reflect, some of the gains that some of the stuff that he has reflected on, but if there are other gains that we have seen throughout the G20 presidencies of the Global South, and how do we ensure that we don't lose that? Because after South Africa, it's moving to the Global North. So how do we ensure that there's continuity and some of the agendas that the Global South had focused on, we don't lose that when there's the transition into the Global North?
No. Thank you for the question. And I think to begin, I would like to take a little step back and reflect on the slogans that have defined the previous G20 presidencies. And I don't know if everyone here remembers, but in 2022, in Indonesia, we had Recover Together, Recover Stronger. Last year, India came up with One Earth, One Family, One Future. This year, the Brazilian slogan was Building a Just World and a Sustainable Planet. And South Africa is coming with solidarity, equality, and sustainability. There are very inspiring words and ideas, but we are still struggling to recover. And the concept of polycrisis is increasingly shaping our daily lives and risking our future, our families, and our planet. So I think while Brazil has made some strides, such as the Global Alliance Against Hunger and Poverty, and also advancing in other commitments like taxing the super rich and reforming global governance, I think the reality that we face is very far from achieving a just and sustainable world. And this gap feels even more pronounced in the light of the disappointment of COP29 last year. So I think there is still a lot to be done. And South Africa is bringing to the table two very important values to Global South countries: solidarity and equality. I think we can all agree that achieving a sustainable planet and without addressing the inequalities and the challenges faced by developing countries like poverty, hunger, and the effects of climate change, the historical and underrepresentation of our countries in key multilateral global decision-making forums. I mean, we must address these topics, otherwise we won't reach a sustainable planet. So I think in this context, the G20, the T20, the other engagement groups can play a crucial role in ensuring Global South agenda, not only in this last presidency, but also in the upcoming one in 2026. So it comes to my mind 5 specific actions. The first one would be setting an agenda with very specific goals and real capacity to transform the G20 dialogues into implementation plans and clear actions for the future. My second point relates to leveraging the Troika support mechanism. I think South Africa not only holds the agenda-setting power for next G20 presidents, but can also count on the collaboration of the previous countries and hopefully the upcoming presidents as well. From a T20 perspective, we had the privilege to work very close with Indonesia, with India, with South Africa, and I think this kind of cooperation is very useful to maintain continuity into policy-making process. Also, from a T20 perspective, I think one of the things we did in Brazil was to foster collaboration in between Global South countries, Global North, as one of the requirements that we had to submission for the policy briefs. So we didn't accept any policy brief that wasn't written by at least 2 different institutions from 2 different countries. And I think the idea was to share knowledge, to share experience in the sense that the recommendations could reflect these challenges and these exchanges and joint solutions from different countries. My next point relates also to the strengthening of the engagement groups and the social G20 as structural tools. I think it would be important to keep these mechanisms to ensure deeper collaboration between engagement groups, between civil society, between the Sherpa and the finance tracks, in a sense that it helps to bridge high-level discussions with think tanks, with the academia, with the private sector, with the parliament, as some of the speakers mentioned yesterday. And this is quite important because it creates a powerful mechanism to link policy dialogues to real world and to implementation plans. And finally, I think it's also important to align global agendas across multilateral spaces. I think I'll stay here for now.
Thank you. So now that we've reflected on the G20 presidencies and some of the efforts that have been made, so I want to bring you there, and it goes back to where we started, this idea of diminishing, the geographical distances and what you reflected on that. Some of the things that we see the Global South experience, some of these issues are transnational, right? And Bramek spoke about this idea that really poverty and hunger is one of our biggest things. So coming from India, perhaps you can, if you can help us reflect on some of the development progress that India has achieved, and what are some of the areas in which the countries in the Global South can learn from India, because most of countries on the Global South are where India had been in the past. So if you can really tell us a developmental story of where India was and where it is, and what are some of the things that we can learn from India.
Thank you so much for that question. I think, way back in the 1960s, we started our ITech program, and the first development partnership initiative was within 2 years of Indian independence. So India started helping other developing countries even when it was finding its own feet and struggling with various development challenges on its own. And of course, we have come a long way. We have made major strides, particularly in eradicating absolute poverty, in eradicating hunger, and there definitely is a lesson for other countries there. We know what needs to be done. We know we need to improve the agricultural productivity. We know we need safety nets for our people. We need an effective public distribution system. India's own public distribution system has contributed immensely towards ameliorating hunger. So we know what needs to be done. We know we need to provide livelihoods. We need to provide livelihood security. We need to empower women. We need to empower communities to eradicate poverty. And some steps have definitely been taken by the Indian government's initiatives, particularly through the Lines of Credit program. And I think Africa is one of the biggest beneficiaries of them. A lot of the Lines of Credit projects have been implemented successfully in African countries, also in our neighboring countries. So we do believe that whatever little we have, we are willing and happy to share. That's the spirit of India's development cooperation program. Sharing our development experience and sharing whatever little we have through knowledge, through technical cooperation, and through concessional lines of credit, which we have done so far. But also now, looking at newer forms of cooperation, cooperating with other countries in third countries, going through the triangular format with many of the northern countries also. So in a nutshell, India is most happy not only to be just the voice of the global south, but also lend a helping hand and hold the hand and together, address many of the collective problems that we continue to face.
Thank you. Bramex, I want to bring you here, and partly because you spoke earlier about, the African Union agenda, the Africa we want to see, right? And so, given that the African Union has a seat in the G20, I'm trying to be generous in the way in which I frame this question. How can we take the African Union seriously as a contributor? Will its input shape the outcome of the G20 deliberation? If the answer is yes, what does that look like? If the answer is no, why is that a problem? And I think we can all agree in this room that we've got a leadership challenge in the African Union. We can spend the whole day here having the conversation about some of really the challenges that we see in this institution. So I want you to really help us more critically that how can the African Union be taken seriously as a contributor, and do we see its input, making a difference in the deliberations within the G20?
Bonola, thanks. I think the first thing we must take into account is that many of these multilateral institutions were built when Africa was just a footnote. And later on, Africa was just an invited guest. Not sitting at the center of the discussions. I think the challenge we're having today is that Africa must not remain in the periphery. For it not to remain in the periphery, it's the work of leadership. You need quality, focused leadership to be able to do this. And that's the point you're making. It must be the leadership that takes itself serious. I've got a suspicion that the kind of leadership we've got at the AU and various of our countries is the leadership that they themselves don't take themselves serious. And I think as Africans, we need to make sure that we call for accountability when it comes to that. Many of you must have seen these embarrassing spectacles where 54 leaders will be invited by the Prime Minister of Italy. And they go, each one of them, greeting and presenting their case. From there, they go and ask for grain from President Putin, despite the fact that we've got so much land here to plow. Nobody is going to take people like that serious. So I think as African citizens, I think we must call for this seriousness in terms of the engagements. But at the same time, when AU has been invited in a platform like this, the AU is much more advanced than everybody else because they've got an African program. And that's the program that needs to be put on the table. And we must argue for partnership in the implementation of that program. But that can be done. That's a job of a serious leadership.
Thank you so much for that. I'm now going to open up a space to get questions from the audience. But before we do that, we have a former minister from India who would like to make an intervention. So I'm going to hand over to you, sir, to make your intervention before I open up space for the audience to ask a question.
No, I just want to make an intervention and will be happy to respond if there's any question. When you had asked what can India do, given its own experiences in development as far as sharing of technologies. An important thing concerning Africa was the Pan-African E-Network project, which was announced when our late president, who was a great scientist, Abul Kalam, had come here. It was in this continent that India launched it, gifted it. Through our dedicated satellites, we linked the entire African continent. 49 countries had joined. It was a major leap, not only to bridge the digital divide, but linking major universities in all regions of Africa, not all the universities, and hospitals, with super specialty hospitals in India and major universities of India. And that was functional. Then finally, it was handed over to the AU. This is one area where, as the world is moving towards digitization, financial inclusion issues, perhaps we can work in partnership. Second area is directly what you were discussing. We have a payment system, payment gate, which is now globally, it has attracted global attention, the RuPay. We're in dialogue with major countries, 30 countries, for the payment system on which there is no burden on the user at all, unlike all other payment systems. And this is something perhaps we should be put on the agenda, discussed, and we can work together.
Thank you, sir. Any question? Okay, it doesn't look like we have any questions in the room. So perhaps maybe I can ask each of the panelists to, for 2 minutes, what are some of the, recommendations and some of the ideas you would want this conversation to land at, that when we almost reimagine what, the Global South should look like for us, what should that look like, and what are some of the things you would want the audience to take home with? I'm going to start with you, Luciana.
Thank you. Yeah. I've been listening to Max very carefully since we were in the speaker's room. And what I feel like saying right now is actually my final remarks relates to this unique opportunity that South Africa leadership will have to advocate for Africa's development, for Africa's interests on the world stage. So I think if I can, by any chance, give a piece of advice, would be selecting key issues where you can make a significant impact to shape global policies and advance Global South and Africa integration and cooperation. Time flies. 1 year is not enough for everything that needs to be done. So I think it's important also to balance the immediate priorities with long-term goals. And I think you have really a unique opportunity to this leadership and to ensure that G20 remains a platform for inclusive, sustainable, equitable growth. And I wish you and my T20 from South Africa friends all the best, good luck, a successful leadership, and try to have some fun along the way as well.
Okay, I think this is an opportune moment for Africa. For a very long period of time, the G20 was taking decisions which affected Africa without any consultation to Africa. For instance, the DSSI and the Common Framework, completely without any inputs from Africa. So there is a very important opportunity to change that. We now have the African Union, and both South Africa during its presidency with AU's presence must ensure that it advances Africa's interest. It fights for its rightful share in the global economy, and it fights to, and I don't want to repeat the same thing which many speakers have said, the global financial institutions are inherently biased against African economies. They need a thorough reform. The current world order will not solve the grave challenges that we are going through. So there is a good opportunity which needs to be leveraged, and the Agenda 2063 is the master plan which Africa needs to work towards. So how can G20 be the platform to help Africa achieve Agenda 2063? And lastly, I just want to add to what Mr. Sharma has already said. He elaborately mentioned about the Pan-African e-network and spoke about the digital sphere. But taking from what Max said, because I was also listening very carefully to everything that he was saying, of course Africa can grow its own food. We learned to do that way back in the 1960s. And definitely we are happy to help. Food is not a commodity. Food is the basic essence of life. So every country must become food secure, and every country must try to grow its own food. So India's experience with Green Revolution should be the bedrock of Africa trying to be food secure. I'll just close with that. Thank you.
Thank you, Wanolo. And just as a couple of conclusions from what we've been talking about, when you're more generous than Max in this regard and without any moral authority, since I'm not from the continent, I do believe that it's a bit of a learning curve to become a full-fledged member of the G20. And in that regard, I think South Africa, during this presidency, will have a bit of a moral duty to help guide the African Union as a full-fledged member. And I think they can do a lot to engage them within the current presidency. And secondly, regarding what we were talking about, working methods, I believe that one of the Brazilian innovations that's also worthwhile to bear in mind, and that South Africa has taken up, is the fact of establishing one-year task forces, because there's a small issue with the development of the G20 throughout the years, and it's something that I have called on more than one occasion the inflationary inertia of every presidency trying to create its working group or its engagement group, if not more than one. And the G20 ends up becoming a behemoth that doesn't have a permanent secretariat, which is good. It allows the forum to retain flexibility that other organizations don't have. But the idea of establishing transitory task forces that don't necessarily crystallize into a working group or an engagement group is something that can help each yearly presidency to obtain the goals that it needs for the benefit of the whole grouping. Thanks.
Bonolo, thanks. I think what Minister was saying earlier on, I think it's important. I think one of the key things that is really possible and practical is for South Africa and the AU to coordinate cooperation much more amongst the countries of the Global South. There's a lot that we can pull together so that we don't sit in this forum as a complaint session against the developed countries. We've got within ourselves to be able to deal with the issues of technology as he has raised. We got within ourselves to be able to deal with this issue of food security. We need to sit amongst ourselves and say, what do we do with our critical minerals? And in that process, we are able to set this global agenda. So that's the first thing that I think it's a practical thing that we can do and do it as a domesticated rather than an imposed idea. The second thing, as I was saying at the beginning, really is to narrow this agenda. If we can narrow this agenda just on the eradication of poverty and say everything we are doing is to make sure that the poverty becomes the issue of the past. It's totally unacceptable that we've got these high levels of poverty in our continent and in the developing world. So then the third thing is there's a lot of intellectuals in the room. I think we need to sit in a forum like this and design and develop accountability measures so that it's clear that when our leadership gets involved in all of these things, what are the expectations from us as citizens, and how are those expectations going to be met? And therefore, what it means is that as a group like the group that we have and Think 20 must remain engaged so that we don't turn these forums into elite forums where our leaders goes once a year. We need to understand what is the practical impact of all of these things on the daily lives of the masses of the Global South. Thanks a lot.
Thank you so much. So just to help us reflect on some of this key stuff that came out of this conversation, we started with this idea that geography matters, but more importantly, collaboration is important. And I think that's something that we need to think critically about. How do we, very early on, as Pramex has just said, we coordinate strong collaborations with different players, but also this idea of a call for a new fabric of leadership, a leadership that really takes itself seriously, and also a call for strong accountability measures. Because if we appoint you and give power to you, then you owe us the right to account to us and adhere to principles of accountability and transparency thereof. But also the fact that this is an opportunity for Africa. This is an opportunity for Africa to use the G20 as a platform to achieve, the African Union agenda, the African Union 2063 agenda of an Africa that we want. So, yeah, thank you so much for helping us think through this conversation, and I hope that we can continue to have this conversation as the day progresses. Thank you.
Thank you to the moderator and to the panelists. If I can invite you to the top of the stage for a quick photograph. I think my big takeaway from this session was poverty must be a thing of the past. So thanks for that, Max. I think that's a good mission statement to chase. We will now break for about 15 minutes. And then we'll come back into this room. Please bring your tea and coffee. We'll have the one last closing plenary session on how to achieve peace. So we'll identify the pathways to achieving peace. And then we will, of course, hear from the Honorable Deputy President of South Africa deliver the valedictory address to all of us. Thank you so much. Bring your tea and coffee inside, and then we'll commence with chasing the pathways to peace and the valedictory address. Thank you.
Yeah. 1, 2, 2, 2. Yeah. Yeah. 2, 2. Kan je me hoor? Ik is baie fair, né? Baie fair. So take that into consideration, né? Yeah, the mere volume, né? Yeah, it's like. Otherwise, I must put it close.
Stand like this? Or do we put a double-sided tape?
They use tape already. Rodney?
Yeah, it's fine.
Yeah. Hij is tight, so. James, you okay? No, just top.
Can you mute this, please?
I was going to do it from. James, shot good. You happy?
The light is fine?
हाँ हाँ तो यहाँ खड़े हो जाता ना, दिखेगा तो बोल दूंगा ना सबको.
आपकी आंखों में लाइट तो नहीं चुभ रही है?
नहीं अभी ठीक है. ये वाली थोड़ी चुभ रही है. ये वाली. Could I request everyone to please rise for the Honorable Deputy President, Paul Mashatile. If I could request everyone to please take their seats. Honorable Deputy President, welcome to Cape Town Conversations. We now move to the final plenary session and the final conversation. We will, of course, hear from the Honorable Deputy President in his valedictory address and also have brief closing remarks from the co-hosts. But before that, may I invite the next panel to discuss paths to peace. The speakers on the panel, Tony Abbott, former Prime Minister of Australia, Ana Miguel dos Santos, former Member of European Parliament from Portugal, Anthony van Nieuwkerk, Professor at the Thabo Mbeki African School of Public and International Affairs, Ambassador Latha Reddy, Co-Chairman of the Global Commission on Stability of Cyberspace, and the moderator, Sanusha Naidu, Senior Research Fellow, Institute for Global Dialogue, South Africa.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Firstly, let me acknowledge Deputy President Paul Mashatile of the Republic of South Africa, former President Thabo Mbeki, former President Tony Abbott, and perhaps to make it easy for me, all protocol observed. What I would like to say is we've come to the final plenary of what has been a very inspiring, thoughtful, insightful, and perceptive Cape Town Conversation too. So thank you so much, Samir, for this, as well as the Thabo Mbeki Foundation, for convening a set of discussions that becomes really relevant in a world where we are trying to find ourselves in many ways. And I think the session that we are now in, which perhaps is a culmination of the last 2 days, Paths to Peace, is essentially that. How do we get to the space of peace? How do we discuss peace? And how do we actually institutionalize it and understand it in terms of its many dimensions and dynamics? I've had difficulty trying to figure what my role as moderator is, given what an illustrious panel I have. And also trying to understand from the brief that I was given that I need to think about this discussion in terms of how I knit and thread everything together in a much more cohesive, coherent way that comes back to what I see as the holy trinity of these discussions, whether it's the Cape Town Conversation whether it's South Africa's chairing of the G20 in the next couple of days, and the many discussions that we have as policy think tank researchers, practitioners, diplomats, ambassadors, prime ministers, etc., as well as civil society and ordinary people about what constitutes peace. And I think one of the things that came very critically into my mind was Action 13 of the Pact for the Future document, which talks about peace being a holy trinity, in my opinion. It's about how do you find stability, how do you find security, but how do you also find the fact that people have to be recognized as equal. Their human rights are not necessarily one prevails over the other. But more importantly, that peace is not just a vertical issue of what constitutes conflict, but rather the impact that has at a horizontal level. And I have a fantastic panel here today to help me unpack, as well as help us understand, hopefully, in the limited time, that we are trying to understand what it is that the perspectives you bring, the impressions you have, and the kind of insights that you would share with everyone in the room today, and of course, the takeaways that we leave Cape Town conversation with. I want to start with the former Australian Prime Minister, Tony Abbott. And I'm going to do it in a way where I come to Antony last, because being the only so-called African panelist on the session, I'm going to ask you to come in last. But I want to take at least 3 minutes for all of you, for Tony, Ambassador Reddy, as well as Anna, to be able to give me in 3 minutes your impressions of some of the key questions around what is pathways to peace. How do we look at that in our current architecture of where we are, the kind of discussions we're having around the interventions, the challenges in terms of whether in the African context, and most importantly, this is a critical discussion for us, is what does it mean to silence the guns, and how do we define this? So from your respective spaces, can you just give me your impressions in 3 minutes? And then we'll come to Antony after that.
Well, thank you, Sanusha. It's wonderful to be here, and it's wonderful to be in the presence of the Deputy President and also the honoured former President Thabo Mbeki. I wonder if I could just offer a couple of thoughts about the current international system. It's far from perfect, but I suspect that we will very much regret it if it ever entirely goes, because if you consider the world in 2020, prior to the pandemic, prior to Ukraine, prior to October the 7th, for all its faults and imperfections and inequalities, it was more free, more fair, more rich and more safe for more people than at any time in human history. It was also a more equal world, unequal but more equal than ever before. And whatever we think of the United States, I think there needs to be some gratitude to the United States for having the strength and benevolence to keep what has been described as the Pax Americana going for so long. That world is now under serious threat from what I think is an alliance of convenience of discontented dictatorships in Moscow, in Tehran, and in Beijing. I reckon that there will be no peace unless all significant countries respect the sovereignty of other countries and refrain from serious interference in their internal affairs. Wherever it occurs, I think aggression does need to be defeated, and otherwise I think aggression does need to be deterred. And there are obvious hotspots, particularly across the Taiwan Straits, where aggression does need to be deterred. I do want to make one final point, though, and I'm grateful to President Mbeki for prompting this final point. The West needs to be careful about demanding that others take sides. I think in the end, democracies in what's often these days called the Global South will choose democracy over dictatorship. But if we try to force a choice upon them, we might find them sitting on the fence, and I don't think that would be a good thing for anyone.
Thank you very much. Ms. Reddy?
Good evening. I wanted to begin by acknowledging, of course, former President Thabo Mbeki. I had the great privilege of working with him in 1994 when I first came to South Africa, and we had many animated discussions in Shell House. I would also like to acknowledge the presence of the Honorable Deputy President of South Africa, and to say that South Africa will always be very special to me because I was here at a very historic time between 1994 and 1997, and I will never ever forget it. I always say it was my most memorable posting. Coming now to the topic of our discussion, which is Pathways to Peace, we need an international system that reflects the real world of today. We need to begin by reforming international organizations such as the United Nations. As we all know, the United Nations Security Council, where we have 5 permanent members, that's the US, Russia, China, UK, and France, do tend to ride roughshod, the 5 permanent members, over the global system due to their veto powers. I think the UN Security Council urgently needs to be reformed and a more equitable system established. Similarly, I think international financial institutions such as the IMF and World Bank are dominated by the developed world. Their priorities are not the priorities of Africa or of the global South. We need an innovative global development finance ecosystem to unlock equitable international financing flows. We need to respect the fiscal sovereignty of developing countries. We need better sources of finance, juxtaposed with the debt crisis that affects many countries, and this is compounded by climate change effects. We need in Africa affordable finance at scale, funding that is appropriately structured, easily accessible, predictable, and dispersed promptly. We need an African agenda for financial system reform. We must be positive rather than passive, authoritative rather than tentative. Most of all, Africa needs a united and coordinated approach. How do we deal with the hypocrisy at the heart of the approach of the developed world towards the developing world? The developed world has traditionally argued that developing countries need guidance, experience, etc., to take charge of their own destinies, whether geopolitical, financial, or social. The same arguments, I might add, were used in India at the time of our independence and in South Africa at the time of its independence. So I think I'll stop here for now, if I may, because I don't want to overrun my time, and pass it on to Anna.
Thank you. Good afternoon to everyone. So I tried to say this, Ausit. It's in hello in South African. So it's Ausit. Ausit. Sorry for my accent. So I will give you some key points of my idea. I think all the people here knows the routes to peace. So I will try to give you another approach. So I will start with what I call it the cycle of peace. So how do we go to the cycle of peace? So stop complaining. And I'm saying this to everyone, even to Europeans. Stop complaining. Stop looking for culprits. We need to start to act. We need action. We need movements. And we need to answer to this question, what do you want to your future? After you answer this, You will give me, what is your project for your future, for your country, for your people? Surely is not the same as the Portuguese or even the Indian, because your needs, your culture, your weather, your climate is different. So we need to respect our differences. Then, after defining our own route, we need to act. Defining our own way and start working on that. Instead of complaining, we need to interact. We need to dialogue. We need to search. And when we start dialogue, we enter in the cycle of peace, because dialogue brings search. Search brings compassion. Compassion brings mutual interests. We need to search and find what is important to the other, because we can dialogue, but if we don't have empathy, if we don't have compassion for the other, if we doesn't seek for mutual understanding, we will not get to a good result. Then, this is good for us to develop trust. With trust comes action. With action comes empathy. And with empathy comes dialogue, and so on. So, we need to act more like a catalytic instead of a deterrent. We need to focus more on solve problems, overcome differences, instead of looking for blames. We are always trying to blame others. Oh, now is the other guilt. What I'm going to do? Stop doing that. Focus on future. Dialogue. Talk and listen, but also understanding. We need to speak, we need to listen, and understanding, and find common and purposes, and try to build a common path. Then, to achieve trust, we need honesty, we need empathy, we need cooperation, we need compassion. We need to be, at the end of the day, we need to be humans. We all make mistakes and good things at the same time. So stop blaming, stop complaining the others. And my friends, to break down the cycle of inaction and complaints and stagnation and division, we need to work on this cycle of leading by the example. We need, and to finish, take responsibility for our future and stop. This is very interesting, and I will stop here. We are always complaining. I defending liberty, but I'm always, instead of choosing my path, I'm always criticizing my neighbor. Stop doing that. Doing your work. As my mother used to say to me when I was a child, focus on your behavior, focus on being better, a better person every day, not focus on the other. Is their path. Focus, and if you focus on the other, bring him to your journey, to your, and build a future together. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Antonia, I'm not going to ask you to reflect. I'm going to actually ask you to pick up what you think are key points from the 3 interventions we've had from our panelists, our fellow panelists, and bring it to the African context, based on where you are, how you're engaging on this, in the context of peace and security, but also in the context of perhaps the kind of cycles of peace that we need. And are we there yet?
Yeah, we're on our way. And I enjoyed your input, Anna. Thank you very much. It's an antidote or the medicine to the CEO of the Thabo Mbeki Foundation, who expressed his cynicism earlier about the talk shop that we have for many years. So I think you are opening a door for us to go through. I hope to pick up on that. You know, if we had more time, Sanusha, we will probably debate the nature of the shifting global order and whether America can be that stabilizing force, Tony, that you mentioned, or whether we actually see a rebalancing of power and influence from west to east and to south. Regardless of that debate, which I think all of us have strong views on, what I know is that this global order is volatile, it's uncertain, it's complex, it's ambiguous, and it impacts negatively on Africa's prospects to achieve that vision of Agenda 2063, an Africa that is at peace, stable, prosperous, and with a strong voice in the international arena. Now, many people argue that we shouldn't despair and complain too much, because the African Union, for 20 years or more, has been able to construct an architecture around peace and security, democracy and development. It has many acronyms. It is in existence, and maybe those institutions, policies and strategies, and a culture of doing should give us hope that Africa is able to identify, mitigate, prevent, and resolve conflict. But it's not that easy. And allow me to say why that is. In particular, the continent faces at least 3 insecurity complexes. There's the Sahel region with a focus on the Lake Chad basin. There's the Great Lakes region, Central Africa, with a focus on the DRC, Congo. And there's the Greater Horn region, where there are real problems in Somalia and in Sudan. And then in Southern Africa, in the past couple of years, we have a mixed experience with democracy, some wins, some destabilization, but also the emergence in our region of volatility around extremism, violent extremism, and how to combat that, or how to prevent it. I don't think that the institutions and the policies and the strategies that we've designed is taking care of the problems that we have. And I'll give you 3 quick examples. I attended a civil society initiative in Uganda and in Kenya to talk about the Great Lakes region, the DRC that spills over into the neighboring countries. What did I hear there from the colleagues on the floor? There's great value in bottom-up, community-based conflict analysis, the role of the voices of the ordinary people who respond to conflict and who respond to states and how they tackle conflict. In fact, I've also learned about the limits of military-led stabilization missions, or as the defense experts would say, counterterrorism strategies. In fact, the East African community deployed into the DRC and then exited, and SADC deployed, and we are still there with South African troops trying to do the same. I attended an assessment, secondly, of the lessons that we can learn from the SADC mission in Mozambique, in northern Mozambique, Cabo Delgado, where there was an outbreak of violent extremism. And what is it that we can learn from that, lessons learned from that experience? The mission has exited now. Peace is relative. Instability is still in parts of Mozambique. 3 lessons: the primacy of democracy and development, the need for good governance and competent state performance, and the limits to counterterrorism activities. 3rd one, and it's a positive one. Earlier in the year, the Thabo Mbeki Foundation organized the inaugural session of the African Peace and Security Dialogue, bringing together people like us. What are the 3 or 4 lessons from there? The first one is dialogue is critically important. Dialogue amongst state and non-state actors, amongst friends and enemies or perceived enemies, is critically important. That needs to continue in our African context. The second one is the AU Agenda 2063, that vision that I mentioned, provides us with a moral guide, a compass, a set of values that is worth maintaining and keeping in mind. The third one is that audience in that dialogue were very critical of African leadership. And they asked for a renewal. The call for a renewal of Africa's leadership came from the youth and the women in the room who were challenging the leaders in the room. which tells me that there's a duty and a responsibility for a transfer of knowledge, wisdom, and experience from the current to the next generation. It's really important.
Tony, I'm just watching time.
You're watching time. I have to give you 2 more.
Which means that for the next round, you don't have much time.
I have to make this point because earlier in this conversation, we were saying as civil society and research institutes, how do we network and connect with each other? In terms of peace and security, we similarly need a continental outreach activity and network our research institutions, not only in the continent, but with colleagues elsewhere in the world. And then, we also have to rethink the AU and APSA, that institutions that I think is not working very well. And we concluded by saying to ourselves, the key here in doing what we're asking for, peace and security, is partnerships. Partnerships between politicians and civil society leaders, between academia and the youth and women. Partnerships amongst ourselves, but also partnerships with our friends and colleagues and allies elsewhere in the world, whether they're in the BRICS alliance or elsewhere on the globe, because Africa needs to work with its partners to get that elusive dream, which is peace and security.
Thank you. I'm going to actually ask Ms. Reddy to come in on some of the points that Anthony has highlighted. In particular, I feel that you mentioned in your opening remarks about the role of the African Union. And one of the points that Anthony has picked up on is the efficacy, the effectiveness, and the efficiency of whether the African Union, and in particular, I think the African Commission on Peace and Security, are they not fit for purpose, but are they still able to garner the kind of engagements, particularly in addressing some of the issues that Anthony raised, but looking at it from the perspective of where India is, and more importantly, understanding what that means in terms of a partnership going forward?
I think the African Union still remains the logical forum, certainly for engagement with Africa, because there's no other forum really that has all the countries of Africa. Can the countries in the African Union overcome national rivalries and narrow concerns and unite to lead Africa is the question. This is essential if we want to really affect change in the world, in all the areas I mentioned, the financial systems, the power structures, such as the United Nations, the international financial systems, as I said, and other international bodies. So I think almost by default, really, it has to be the African Union. I don't see an alternative. I hope that answers the question.
Thank you. And I see your hand.
I just want to add a phrase and a thought regarding to this and connecting with my previous statement. If you want to, and I make the analogy with my childhood and all the childhood, instead of criticizing the other and trying to change the others and impose your vision to the others, fulfill yourself with strength. Strengthening the African Union is a good way to achieve your power, to show your power that, and showing that the world order like United Nations or other organizations are not in a good way or in a good path. So if you improve yourself, if you strengthening your organizations, your more regional or local organizations, it's better for you to take a good position in the world. So spending more time fulfilling this instead of spending your time criticizing the other institutions. Normally we used to say, when we don't like something, we don't buy it.
So, do you want to make some intervention on this?
Well, certainly. Look, I think it's all very well talking about partnerships, about compromise, and about global and regional bodies. But in the end, if a country is set on dominion, you either surrender or you resist. There are binary choices in the world, and I just think that if you look at Ukraine, either it will continue to be an independent country or it won't. Either Israel will continue to exist or it won't. Taiwan will continue to be a practically independent country or it won't. And I just think we have to face up to the fact that sometimes we just have to make extremely hard choices. And while we're on the topic, could I just say I think there's a very big role for India in the decades ahead. For the best part of 70 years, the United States has been effectively the leader of the free world. And if we want the free world to continue in the decades to come, I think India will have to step up and become a co-equal with the United States as the leader of the free world. And if I may say so, I think that's a much better role for India than being a junior partner to China in the BRICS.
Yes, please go ahead. Please go ahead.
I think I would gracefully accept the point made by Mr. Abbott. And India will be delighted to work in whatever way it can and to really further the cause of democracy. I think democracy is very, very important. We've joined several bodies that further the cause of democracy. And I think it's important to show that a country can be democratic and successful at the same time. And, so India is up to it, and India will be happy to do the job that it's been assigned. Thank you.
From your lips to God's ears. Yeah. Antonio, I know you're itching to say something, and I've got 2 minutes to give you because I want to open it up to the audience.
Yeah, I was the first one to say we have to hear the audience as well. And many young people asked me yesterday whether they can have some voice in this conference, and I think we should privilege them. You know, for Africa, we shouldn't get embroiled in this kind of contest between America as the leader of the free world and India shouldn't be a junior partner of China. That doesn't work for me or for us in Africa. We don't see binaries the way that you put it. We look at the world and say, where can we serve the African interest best? So our leadership here goes to America.
So if someone attacks South Africa, will South Africa resist?
Hello. Hi, I'm still
our
the
leadership
moderator.
goes to America and see whether we can save AGOA, our trade relationship. At the same time, we co-here in BRICS to see what the trade relationship with China and India can look like. And we try and find a foreign policy that can be balanced in all these continental sort of outreach achievements. The second thing is, I agree with the other statement here, let's not wait for the UN to reform itself. Let's not wait for the P5, who are supposed to open the door for Africa to take up a permanent seat or two. What we hear is without the veto. The leader of the free world offers a position for us minus the veto. I'm saying let's stay away from that debate. Let us reform the AU ourselves so that it can be more effective in anticipating, mitigating, and resolving conflict on the continent. And that is, Sanusha, where the partnerships must come from.
Thank you. Before I come to you, I want to also bring in the audience here, because I think we've touched on some very interesting but very sensitive issues at the same time in terms of how the debate, the discussion, and the narrative is constructed. And if you can start getting to the mics on the side, again, introduce yourself. If you have a question, if it's directed to a particular panelist, please indicate that. If you have a comment, keep it as succinct as possible. We would appreciate it. As we're waiting for that to happen, maybe Samir.
Hi.
Yes,
Thank
go
you.
for it.
No, thank you. I think this is a great conversation to cap off a two-day conversation, Cape Town conversations. Just a question to Tony Abbott and a question to colleagues from the Global South on the panel, if you identify as from the Global South. To Tony Abbott, look, I get the sentiment, defending the free world and partnering for democracy. But you would agree that in the 20th century, the countries you laud have partnered with all sorts of dictatorships for issues that were convenient for them. They were necessarily not choosing their friends on the basis of democracy, but rather on the basis of both convenience and interest. So how do we reconcile your actions with what is being today served as a cautionary note to others? That's one part. But for the global south, and this is a fair point, that we have accused, like I have just accused the Prime Minister Abbott, we have accused the West of discarding values and morals in their conduct of diplomacy and foreign policy. And are we doing the same by actually choosing mercantilist benefits over a more values-based framework? So I think there's two sides. How do you both reconcile your positions when you sit there?
Thank you, Samir. I recognize the gentleman on this end.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, distinguished audience. So I'm Major General Chandana Wickramasinghe from Sri Lanka. And I'm grateful to the countries and the stage as well, those who supported during the time of Sri Lanka needed, as the regional spillover effect. And they say that the United States, the North-South gap, and there's a lacuna to see that there's a problem. The US State Department stated that consider Sri Lanka to be the epicenter of the 21st century struggle for regional influence. In that case, I would like to supporting all ambassadors and the sirs. And similar countries, the island nation, if you take the Sri Lanka, the west is the South Africa, when you are going to the next the next level, and the far east, Australia, and the closest neighbor, India. So these three triangulation will be important for regional influence plus the stability. And Sri Lanka has been always have some evolution of many issues, but country against stability. Please, sir, the epicenter of influence in the regional, I would like to ask the Honorable Prime Minister, sir, the former Prime Minister, and the Ambassador, Madam, for you. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Can we have the mic here for Mr. Sharma? Yes.
Well, very interesting observations have come. I just have to say one thing. Thanks, Tony Abbott, about India, your praise for our democracy. One thing I want to say, having been in public life for over 5 decades, India respects all its partner countries, big or small. India will never be a junior partner to any country, irrespective of their military power or monetary power. Secondly, I have a question. Are all the countries who have mandated to uphold the UN Charter and the Human Rights Charter, signed in 1948, respecting it in letter and spirit, or making convenient exceptions? I come from a country which has been victim, and we condemn terrorism. But human rights belong to all the citizens of the world. For act of any action, reprehensible as they were on 7th of October, can an entire people, children and women, the targeted killings, be acceptable under the Human Charter? And that is what has made Middle East volatile. To my mind, Palestinian women, children, and people have equal rights too. And the world must respect that.
I'm not sure what that noise is. Should I just wait? Okay, thank you.
It's a fire alarm?
It's a fire alarm. I recognize one other speaker that's there. Can you go ahead, ma'am?
Yes, hello. Thank you very much. So the International Committee of the Red Cross recorded 20 conflicts 25 years ago and 120 today. And so my question to the panel is, How do you succeed in making peace a global and common political priority across the North-South divide? Thank you.
Thank you. So, you've had a few questions directed at you. One from Samir on reconciliation, another on the epicenter.
Yeah. Well, look, just very briefly, I take Samir's point about hypocrisy. And who of us have not been occasionally guilty of double standards? Which of us haven't occasionally spoken out of both sides of our mouths? I'm not saying that the West is perfect. I'm not even saying that it's always good, but I would argue that compared to the dictatorships, it's better. That's all. That's all I'd say. And I would concede absolutely to the Minister that independent India has an outstanding record as a regional and global citizen. India has never attacked anyone. It has been attacked on a number of occasions, savagely. It's resisted as it should, but its record is exemplary, and that's why I have a lot of faith in India as a force for good, a continuing force for good in the years and decades to come. And look, as for the terrible situation in Gaza, I absolutely accept that it's dreadful, 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 dreadful that there have been so many casualties in Israel's fight back against Hamas. But I think we also have to accept that it is very difficult to wage war when your enemy is hiding behind human shields. I think we have to accept that. And I think we also have to accept that if Hamas released the hostages, those that are still alive, and if Hamas were to accept Israel's right to exist, the war would end now. It would end now. And I think our pressure should be on Hamas to release the hostages and accept Israel's right to exist.
I just want to touch briefly on all the questions. Samir did mention that he wanted the perspective of the global South. And yes, it is true that every country has been, to a certain extent, guilty in terms of pursuing its own national interest, whether it's by pursuing mercantile goals, as he said. But at the same time, I think to completely be devoid of moral obligations would be a mistake. I personally am a great admirer of Nehru and the Nehruvian ideals that he espoused. And I think that today to just completely discard that philosophy would be a mistake. On the question raised by the gentleman from Sri Lanka, I think where regional affairs are concerned, in fact, he and I had a brief discussion. We did, in fact, try to position India as sort of a regional security provider. This was when I was Deputy National Security Advisor. And we set up a network between Sri Lanka, the Maldives, and India, which was later expanded to include Seychelles and Mauritius as well. And, you know, I think we do have an obligation to ensure security in the region. And on Mr. Anand Sharma's points, I completely understand that we respect all countries, irrespective of their system of government. And I do stand with him where the question of India being a victim of terrorism is concerned, and also on the situation in the Middle East. On the final point made by the representative of ICRC, there are 120 conflicts in the world today. That's a horrifying total. How do we ensure peace? I think that's really the question we are here to debate. And the only way we can ensure peace is by dialogue, by opening up channels of communication and talking to each other. Otherwise, I don't see a solution.
Anna.
Sorry. I just want to add a thing. We are talking about humans, so beside the conflicts and the wars that are going on, unfortunately, there are so many people starving. And for a politician, it's very difficult to deal with that. How can we deal also with that? People are dying because of poverty, with hungry, and so on. So we need to change the paradigm. We need to, and answering to you, sir, I'm totally agree with your perspective, but I think that we all fail as politicians. And I put myself in I am not responsible, of course, but I put myself. Because we need to change and stop blaming each other. We need to stop. We need to get to a point. I know this is difficult, even utopic, but we need to work on that. Otherwise, and it's very difficult. Even, for example, for Europe, being from a country and a continent that we are now facing war. For us, war used to be something very far away, and now is there. We need to be the adults. We need to growing up and to speak about these issues with no fear of speaking about this. And the question is that if you speak about anything, now you are being accused of, supporting. We need to get to a commitment, a mutual commitment. And for that, we need to have more compassion and listen to the other and try to put our guns down and trying to get commitments.
Anthony.
I'm very proud of the South African team, including politicians, who take the Israeli cause to The Hague, to the International Court of Justice, where Israel must answer to the challenge of genocide or acts of genocide, and all the other countries that are supporting this cause. I'm very proud of them. Politicians can play a very important role. But that points to something else, and it's the big picture for me. It's the fracturing of the system of global governance that we live through today. It's impacting on Africa. You are reminding us on the impact on Europe and elsewhere. The question is, what is the vehicle for us all? The vehicle is the United Nations system, imperfect as it is. The global South relies on and depends on the smooth functioning of the UN system in all of its components to address all of the issues that's on your agenda. And the role that we can play, including our politicians, is to help improve the functioning of the UN system, because it's the last bastion against improper behavior of the superpowers who are chasing realism instead of a common future.
Thank you. I see one gentleman there. With the permission of the organizers, can I ask him to... Thank you. Please go ahead, sir.
Thank you. Sutikon from Thailand. North and South, West and East, we have to accept a new reality that the Global South is rising. And the rise of Global South is more like equalization of the world. So since on the panel we have half Global North, half Global South, I would like to ask you how the Global North would want the Global South to readjust their position, their whatever political stance and so on, to be able to accept them as equal partner. And on another side, from the Global South, what you want those Global North to adjust themselves in the way that would allow you to be equally represented. So this is the questions between each other.
Thank you very much. Time is up, but I'm going to actually ask you to respond with your concluding remarks from Anthony coming down.
That's a brilliant question. If you should be a panel member. I'm missing something in the discussion. I don't hear the Global South telling us in nice diplomatic language what it is that the partnerships can look like. And I wonder if there's a poverty of ideas. there's an anxiety about the shifting global order towards the East and towards the South. What does the South want from the global North? We are ready with many propositions and proposals. This entire Cape Town conversation came up with an agenda, which I hope somebody will summarize for us in a minute, of what it is that we can build together in the interest of humanity. I want to say one more thing. When I listen to American politicians and national security advisors, they view BRICS as a threat to itself, to American interests. The thing about BRICS for me, with which many in the global South associate, is that we are building a community of self-help to produce the kind of outcomes that we want for humanity. And in that way, it opens the door for partnerships and not confrontation.
Thank you, Antonio.
So, Anthony, I came from, sorry, and I'm not coming from the global South. I came from the North globe. So the question is, for me, is very simple. I'm trying to, and I try to summarize my big idea. There are issues that need global answers, and as a humankind, we need to respond. For example, climate changes and energy and so on. But there are other needs that needs regional answers. So that's why we need to put not only the pressure in the United Nations, because it's very difficult for you to get a common sense with 100 and to almost 200 countries, 8 billion people in the world. How can you get one? No, we need to work on diversity and how to figure out. If we start with only common sense, my opinion is better than yours, we will not achieve. So we need to put our efforts in regional answers to some questions that are more common. For example, for me as an European, for a Portuguese, even in European Union, the people of Sweden doesn't understand why we in Portugal, after, or even in Spain, after lunch, we need to take some time to sleep or to get a nap because of the weather. Yes, this changed a lot because we have good sun, good beaches, so this makes differences, and we need to adapt to our climate and our region. So this is...
Thank you very much.
I think it's very simple. What do we want from the global South? We want a seat at the high table. We want to set the agenda. We want our voice to be heard. And finally, we want a new system of equitable governance.
Thank you. Sir?
Sorry. Before
we got time up.
just to yeah, sorry. Just to finish. I didn't finish. I came from the global North, but I'm truly appreciate the global South. So I will appreciate your initiatives. So this is the.
Thank you.
Well, I don't think there should be top dogs and underdogs. I think every dog should have his day. I think that's essentially it. And look. When I was Prime Minister, I tried to treat all countries with respect, and as far as we could help in Australia, I tried to ensure that we were helpful. And in terms of the Global South advancing, I don't think there's any great secret to it. As far as is humanly possible, the countries of the Global South need clean elections, honest judges, decent teachers, and a strong civic culture. And with all those things and a fair go from others, eventually the South will flourish. And the truth is that the Global South's position is vastly better today than it was 20 years ago.
Thank you very much. Let's give them a hand of applause.
Thank you so much to the panel. If I could invite you to the top of the stage for a quick photograph. I'll also request my colleagues to get the stage organized such that we can have the valedictory address. नहीं कुछ नहीं वो हाँ नेम टैग हटा लो can you just come there? Yeah. It's an absolute privilege of us as the Thabo Mbeki Foundation, ORF and ORF America to now invite the Honorable Paul Mashatile, Deputy President of the Republic of South Africa, to deliver the valedictory address as we come to the conclusion of the second edition of Cape Town Conversations. Sir.
I was still enjoying the panelists, their very interesting ideas, controversial subject, but time is not on our side. When we received the invitation from the Thabo Mbeki Foundation, I said to my office, I want to be here the whole day. But it was not possible because I had to chair the JCPS cluster because of the challenges that many of you are aware of in the country with justice, crime prevention, and so on. But let me thank you, Program Director, former President of South Africa and patron of the Thabo Mbeki Foundation, His Excellency Thabo Mbeki, former Prime Minister of Australia, His Excellency Tony Abbott, former Prime Minister of Mali, His Excellency Moussa Mara, Speaker of the National Assembly, Honorable Togo Didiza. I didn't see her when I was coming in, maybe she's left. Former Minister of Commerce and Industry of India, Honorable Anand Sharma, Chairman, Observer Research Foundation of India, Mr. Sanjay Joshi, President, Observer Research Foundation, India, Mr. Samir Saran, Chief Executive of the Thabo Mbeki Foundation, Mr. Max Botwana, distinguished guests, and everybody here present this afternoon. I'm really delighted to have been invited to participate in this second Cape Town conversation. The conversation takes place at the time of tectonic shifts in global politics. The world is facing a polycrisis characterized, amongst others, by high levels of poverty, inequality, economic stagnation, climate change, wars, amongst others. Over the past 3 days, we are aware that delegates here have engaged in identifying responses to the emerging challenges, including assessing progress on the outcome of the first Cape Town conversation. We regard this gathering as a critical and important platform in which you have taken it upon yourselves to reimagine the world by having honest reflections about where we are globally, and most importantly, how we want to chart the path ahead. Equally, in our country, over the past 30 years, since the dawn of democracy, we have been hard at work building a better life for all and contributing to a better Africa and a better world. We have taken it upon ourselves that our development as a country is intricately linked to the development and growth of our continent, and indeed the world. In this context, we have been working on the continent for peace, stability, and security to silence the guns. Equally, we take a non-aligned stance in conflict and prioritize social justice, peace, and development across the world. Similarly, we have always been critical of the reforms of the United Nations and all its organs because we want equal opportunities for the rest of the continent. We have also demonstrated our appreciation and commitment for peace by taking Israel to the ICJ because of the crimes committed against the people of Palestine, particularly in Gaza. As President Mandela said, we know too well that our freedom is incomplete without the freedom of the Palestinians. It is for this reason that we stand in solidarity with others. We stand in solidarity with the people of Cuba, Western Sahara, Sudan, South Sudan, and many parts of the world where there is conflict, where there is wars and insecurity. This we do because of solidarity and our commitment to unity. Compatriots and fellow delegates, we must resolve conflicts in Africa. In this regard, I would like to thank President Mbeki for his continued efforts for peace and security of the African continent. Equally, we must find lasting peace across the world, since when there are wars and conflicts, access to key resources becomes a big challenge, affecting economies, but more importantly, development. As countries of the Global South, we must therefore firmly ground our multilateral cooperation in the synergy between peace and development. Compatriots and fellow delegates, South Africa will assume the G20 presidency on the 1st of December this year, in a few days' time. The overarching theme that we chose for ourselves as South Africa, as we will be taking the presidency, is solidarity, equality, and sustainable development. South Africa intends to place Africa's development at the top of the agenda of the G20. We shall use this opportunity presented by the G20 to advance the priorities of the AU's Agenda 2063, which is the Africa we want. And we will do this in close collaboration with all others in the African Union. Through our G20 or throughout our G20 tenure, we will guarantee that the G20 remains attuned to the requirements of the developing economies in Africa and the broader global South. South Africa firmly believes that the G20, with the United Nations at its center, is vital in accelerating the implementation of sustainable development goals. The global stagnation in advancing sustainable development is concerning and highlights the need for international cooperation in addressing these challenges, including those related to illicit financial flows, as an example. This would ensure that low and middle income countries have equitable access to sustainable development. Compatriots and fellow delegates, you will agree with me that there needs to be an expansion in the accessibility of affordable, reliable, and sustainable finance for low and middle income countries. Our countries also still need to make strides in areas such as energy, capacity building, access to affordable technology, particularly in the public domain, mutually beneficial technology cooperation, financing mitigation actions, particularly in the energy sector. Following some of your discussions, I'm pleased that there is some consensus that we should strengthen global collaboration through multilateralism to achieve our goals. South Africa believes that multilateral development banks and the International Monetary Fund, IMF, needs to be reformed to meet the needs of growing economies for sustainable development and climate resilience. This is some of the things I had the panelists also advocating. Presently, multilateral support is out of reach for most of the world's population, particularly due to risk-averse lending policies that impose heavy costs and conditions. South Africa is acting as a bridge between the global South and the international community, advocating for inclusive policies that represent the interests of low and middle income countries. As a member of international organizations like the United Nations, the African Union, BRICS, South Africa actively participates in domestic efforts to address these issues that are affecting developing countries. South Africa advocates for policies encouraging economic development, poverty eradication, social fairness, and sustainability in developing countries. This includes fair trade and fair trade agreements, debt relief, access to critical services such as healthcare and education, and also combating climate change. Through advocating for these interests on a global scale, South Africa ensures that the voices of these countries in the global South are heard and their demands are met in these international talks. This role as a mediator and advocate for the Global South, assist in building a more equal and inclusive international community. Compatriots and fellow delegates, South Africa also places importance on the issue of critical minerals and will seek to highlight this during its G20 presidency. The country aims to address issues of beneficiation, domestic resource mobilization, critical mineral strategy, interdependent supply chains, and natural capital. These minerals are crucial for a just transition and a green economy, and deliberations on the type of investment required to address these issues remains relevant today. During the Foundation's Africa Day lecture, Professor Adulei Bathili asked this question, whether Africa should remain the provider of raw materials whilst our population is dying of hunger. This question struck me and remained a point I continue to ponder on. And I want to say that indeed we must not continue to be raw material suppliers and allow our fertile lands to be auctioned off by international investors who come to exploit our raw minerals and export them to other countries. At the same time, our people remain jobless and continue to languish in poverty. Compatriots and fellow delegates, over the past 3 days, some discussions, some talks, have centered on the transformation of global governance, creating new growth pathways, and developing actionable solutions. In this regard, we are dedicating ourselves to offering a distinct opportunity to elevate the requirements, aspirations, and ambitions of countries in the Global South. South Africa intends to build on the success of the Indonesian, Indian, and Brazilian G20 presidents and use its presidency to advance global reform agendas, particularly, as I said, in transforming global financial architecture and reforming those institutions like the IMF, the World Bank, and some of these multilateral development banks. We are also considering monitoring the G20's past commitments and the possibility of a G20 review. As we all know that with South Africa taking over the presidency, we are now completing a full cycle. So we think there should be a review of what has been happening before we will obviously hand over to the United States to take over. South Africa will thus persist in promoting, and this is very important to us, persist in promoting the peaceful resolution of global conflicts. Our foreign policy is guided by the principles of solidarity, peace, equality, human rights, and sustainable development for the collective benefit. We will persist in fulfilling this commitment without undue pressure and in line with South Africa's national sovereign interests. We welcome Lebanon's ceasefire and hope for an end to the genocide in Gaza. We hope that the ceasefire deal between Israel and Hezbollah will help bring stability to the region and end the cycle of violence along that border. What we want to see now is the urgent need to improve humanitarian conditions. Let the guns be silenced in this continent, but also around the world, and let unity and peace reign. Ladies and gentlemen, amid all these challenges, there are many opportunities. We believe the Global South remains the ray of hope. It encapsulates regions where economic growth has remained steady, populations are receptive to new ideas and transformative policies, and the political will for change remains very strong. We can all agree that countries in the Global South have immense potential for growth and development, which exists in our communities. We can capitalize on these new opportunities, whether in business, education, or innovation, to uplift and empower one another. Africa has been gaining more attention from the international community because of its dynamic economic progress. But as developing countries, we should also leverage on the digital economy to transform traditional economic processes, as this is the direction the global world is headed towards. Therefore, we must ensure that entrepreneurs, innovators, and workers harness digital technologies to meet their needs. However, we remain cognizant that the Global South is also industrializing and digitizing simultaneously. It is important for us to maintain balance and be inclusive in our programs and policies so that we leave no one behind. We must capitalize on the opportunities presented by the African Continental Free Trade Area, which establishes a unified continental market for products and services in Africa. It seeks to expedite inter-Africa trade and has the potential to enhance our economies and improve the quality of life of the people throughout the continent. This will result in the diversification of exports, the acceleration of growth, and an increase in investment and employment possibilities for South Africans and other Africans, and of course, the broader continent as a whole. For success, African countries must prioritize the development of infrastructure, particularly for rail and road transport, as it is the most favored mode of transporting products, services, and also passengers. We must also invest heavily as South Africa in our ports to ensure efficient freight logistics. And as we do so, we also work with others in the continent. Compatriots and fellow delegates, another obstacle to our success is the effect of climate change, which impacts the environment and livelihoods and result in socio-economic distress. To prevent such occurrences, we must remain dedicated to fulfilling the obligations outlined in the nationally determined contributions under the Paris Agreement. To effectively respond to these disasters, and many of you would probably have seen in our own country here in various provinces, we've had floods and fires, etc., in KZN and other parts of our country. We must adjust our macroeconomic policies and create policy flexibility to address these challenges that we face today, especially these frequent weather shocks. We must also enhance infrastructure to be able to enhance economic resilience. As we work hard towards net zero, wealthier countries must afford us time to adjust, but also ensure financial support to countries in the global south, and also policy assistance where required. Fellow delegates, as I conclude, I want to say that as we part ways for our respective destinations, our focus should be on implementing what has been discussed in this conference during these conversations. Because in many occasions, people go to conferences or seminars, we have good discussions, we take good resolutions, and then we don't implement. So it's important that we have to ensure that there is implementation. And indeed, the best way to measure a conference's success, it is to implement the resolution, so that when we come back to the next conference, to the next conversation, we are able to weigh and see if indeed we have been successful, and also see where the challenges still remain. Our country's development lies on our shoulders and nobody else. We must agree to do all we can to ensure a better future for the next generations. As former President Nelson Mandela once said, it always seems impossible until it is done. Therefore, we must speed implementation, because the speed of execution is the one that is going to ensure that we succeed. The speed of execution must remain our mantra. I want to take this opportunity, compatriots and fellow delegates, to wish you well. I know that we will be departing to various destinations, but I hope that we're not seeing one another for the last time. These conversations are very important, and I want to thank former President Thabo Mbeki for leading this charge. And President Mbeki, I am sure that we as South Africans have gained a lot of experience now that this is the second conversation. The next one Of course, we do want others to help us, but we, with yourself, will be at the forefront of it. We will invite you, but we are going to lead it. Yes. We have gained a lot of experience now, and I'll also make sure that my office make time that I participate throughout the day, because I want to, the engagements are very exciting, interesting. I want to be part of them. But thank you very much to afford me this opportunity as we come to the end of this important conference, these conversations. I'm looking forward to seeing you, most of you, again. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, sir. It's an honor to have you here, and glad to hear that next year you will be with us throughout the conference. We really look forward to having you join us next time as well. With that, may I now invite Dr. Samir Saran, President at ORF, to propose the closing remarks and a vote of thanks.
Thank you. Thank you, Shubh. Thank you, Deputy President Paul Marshall Tile. President Mbeki had given me a task at the beginning of the conference to create a summary of the issues we must take forward. Your speech covered it all. I was just sitting there and actually really reflecting on the speech that you delivered today. And literally across 40 different conversations, the various ideas that we produce collectively, you captured in your oration this evening. Thank you so much for speaking to us. We began with drum beats. Who all were here in this room that day when we began that evening? Who all have a blue hand? My hand hurts. We began with the rhythm of the drums. We nearly got it right. But we have got to do better when we have to reform the global governance architecture. There we need to be in sync, and that is the message that is coming out of this conversation, that we are different, we have different geographies, we have different histories, we have different economies, we have a common future. And therefore we must double down and work harder to connect the rhythms that in many ways shape each of our societies, cultures and communities. And that is, I think, the core message coming out of Cape Town this time around. So I first want all of us who are in Cape Town, who are visiting Cape Town, to stand up and deliver a rousing thank you to all our hosts for the wonderful hospitality, for the wonderful music, for the wonderful friendship, and for the wonderful 3 days that we've had. Please stand up and applaud President Mbeki, the hotel, and of course, all of you. Thank you, sir. Thank you. When we began 2 years ago, India was at that point the president of the G20 plurilateral group, and it was, I remember Max who said it, that it was Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam, the world is one village, the Indian ethic, to Ubuntu, that in all we see our humanity. It was these two ethics that created this partnership between Thabo Mbeki Foundation and the Observer Research Foundation. The world is one village, we are one community, and we walk together. It is also the two towering personalities that have defined modern South Africa and modern India, Mahatma Gandhi and Nelson Mandela, and their visions and their inspirations to all of us that have helped shape this program. And therefore, it is a natural fit. This partnership between India and South Africa to create this global conversation is a fitting tribute to those leaders who sought a fairer, more just and more equitable world. And this, in some ways, is a tribute to the aspirations of those leaders for the directions that the people must choose. Before I close, I must mention that through this day, and I can see a full room right now, but through this day, there's only one person who's heard every word in this conference, and that is President Thabo Mbeki. He is the only one who has heard everyone, who has diligently given time to everyone who had something to share. And I think that is, for me, the core message out of Cape Town. It is not important to be here on the stage speaking. It is important to listen. President Mbeki listened to all of us. And I think that itself is something we should take back from us. Take back from this conference. We have to listen more and speak less. Thank you, President. I have promised President Mbeki and my dear friend Max, who will speak to us, that we together, the foundations, will produce a call for action that we will present to the Honorable Deputy President and the leadership in South Africa for their consideration based on the rich conversations we have had. Over the next week, we will finalize this and we will make it available to all of you as well. This is something that we must do to take forward the agenda of having these very rich deliberations. And we must individually go back to our countries and impress on our political leadership, business leadership, and community leadership to take heed of the opportunity we have in these dark times to actually bring transformation that is desperately needed. So I hope you take back the Cape Town message with you, and we work in our own individual spaces to build a better world so that when we come back next year, we have something to cheer about. So thank you for being with us this time around, and namaste, thank you, and see you next year.
Max?
My brother Samir there is from Delhi, but he spends in a year, I suspect, 2 weeks in Delhi. He travels throughout the country, and my team thought I'm the most energetic person they know until we met Samir. Thanks a lot, Samir. But Mr. President, Deputy President Mashatile, Excellencies, friends and colleagues, we have come to a pause in an otherwise exciting 3 days of another successful annual Cape Town Conversations. I'm just here to thank each and every one of you for taking time to be with us in these 3 days, sharing your thoughts, your insights, experiences and hopes of moving the Global South from the periphery to the center of the global agenda. I need to thank once again Samir for providing the leadership to all our teams, providing guidance and direction until this moment. I also want to thank our panelists and moderators for keeping this event as informative and insightful as it was. I want to return to our guest speakers and say to Deputy President Mashatile, we are your partners as South Africa is taking its rightful place as the chair of the G20. You can count on us, sir. I thank the Speaker of Parliament, Ms. Togo Didiza, who opened this meeting for us, and our other speakers, Sanjay Joshi, Nelson Murphy, Park Stau, Minister Nchaveni, Prime Minister Tony Abbott, Prime Minister Musa Mara, for all of the presentations and insightful experiences that you have shared with us. I also want to thank the editors and the contributors to the Cape Town Chronicle, because that's the idea of immortalizing the discussions that are taking place. That's a precursor to set out the thinking for this meeting. And as Samir is saying, we will then work out the action plans and other suggestions that we want to share with the G20 leadership. But I must do this, Samir, and repeat what you are saying, and really thank President Mbeki for his generosity of spirit and time, and for the time and guidance that he has provided us, and the questions that he keeps on asking so that we remain on track. I'm glad then, Samir, that we are about to finish the call to action that President has asked of us. But one of the defining features of this year's Cape Town conversation has been the youth representation. I'm glad that I'm sitting in a room where almost more than 60% of those that are present are the one whose future we are discussing, because I suspect some of us, our future has already been destroyed. We were also quite excited about some of the inputs, Samir, that some colleagues have sent to us in terms of how we can do this thing better next time. It's a demonstration of how many people have actually taken over all of these conversations as theirs. And I'm glad that they feel that sense of ownership. But to all of the delegates that stood up and clapped hands, our Speaker of Parliament, Toko Didiza, has already invited all of you to explore the scenic landscape of the Ferris Cape, to visit its oceans, and maybe to hop onto a boat to Robben Island to rekindle the idea of the importance of the triumph over adversity, or continue in this wine route and not overindulge. But understand that despite the difficulties we've been discussing in this room, there's a beautiful world out there to enjoy. So as we're about to disperse and close this gathering that has been sitting in Cape Town for the past 3 days, let us imagine that the masses of the Global South are waiting on us as principled and committed agents to live up to the promise of turning decades of hope, deferred dreams, into a practical program that will help turn these aspirations into realities of building a caring and a humane global order. Those that will be traveling back home, we wish you a safe journey. Thank you very much to each and every one of you. Namaste, asanteni sana. The meeting is adjourned until we meet again on the 24th of December, 2025. But let the conversations continue. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Max, and thanks, Dr. Saran. I think that's it. Just the last piece of housekeeping announcement. Please do enjoy the city. We have a free evening today, but in case you're back at the hotel in time, we do have some dinner, and apparently there's a band as well. So if you want to enjoy some music in the hotel, you can please join us in the restaurant. The travel desk is there for your airport departures this evening and tomorrow. With that, thank you so much. Enjoy your evening.